This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Not so bad yourself?
Good. I'm trying to hold back my giggles because what I wanted to say was I was surprised you showed up for the podcast today and you don't have the new Apple Vision Pro on your face. That's what I was expecting, man.
I have one on order. It will arrive in 3 to 4 weeks, allegedly. We'll see. I'm curious. I've probably watched every video, review. I am cautiously optimistic. I got to be honest. It's going to have to really blow me away for me to part with $3,400 of this thing on my face. But it looks really cool.
Yeah, right. I could see you sitting at Chili's, having your chips and queso, wearing your headset and looking all over the place, maybe getting some work done. I mean, you are the early adopter of early adopters.
I am an early adopter, but it's more like in secret. I don't want to be like that guy out there wearing the Vision Pro, skating around New York City like Casey Neistat from YouTube or anything like that. I'm more of a subtle kind of early adopter. At home, I'll nerd out all day long, but in public, I try to keep it to a minimum. I'm enough of a nerd. I don't need to amplify it any more than I already am.
So what I wanted to ask you about early adoptership, does that carry over into your IAM life? In other words, are you an early adopter of IAM technology? Like if you think ITDR is like it, are you in? And are you an early adopter of vendors? So in other words, maybe there's a dominant vendor or two. Do you consider the ones that are not the dominant? Or maybe they're new, or you don't have a whole lot of reference points?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say no. I'm not typically an early adopter. I think I'm approaching a little more pragmatically. I have to separate my thought that, oh, that's a really cool piece of technology, or really like that, with the business side of my brain. That is, does it make sense? What does it cost? How does this fit into my current stack of technologies? I have to separate that from the, boy, that's really cool. So I would say I'm not an early adopter in the real world when it comes to identity, but it's not because I don't appreciate the technologies. It's more of a fiscal, responsible, say, okay, great. If I had a limited budget, sure, I'd throw stuff in, try stuff all the time. I don't. Most people don't. There's limited time, limited resources, and there's just not enough time in the world to try and keep up with every single tech that's out there. Some, I think, are better than others, or at least more immediate. Like ITDR has been hot for the last couple of years. I think if you've got everything else solved, it seems to me like a natural evolution to go that way. What do you think?
Well, I think when it comes to new technology, well, first off, I just think it's like a personality trait. I lean toward being more conservative. I think both of my grandfathers were accountants, right? And accountants are about as conservative as you can get. I spent most of my career working in more conservative organizations, but since I've been in consulting, which is over a decade now, I've seen a lot of technologies kind of come and go. I've also seen where certain technologies, when they hit, they just hit and address a problem that the industry has. So I think oddly enough, in my old age, I think I'd lean more toward being a little more experimental in new technologies. When it comes to new vendors, I feel like you've got to be a little more adventurous. You have to look at those mainline, like, the saying, like, nobody got fired for choosing IBM. I don't buy into statements like that, but at the same time, I don't rail against them. I kind of think like, okay, you need to look at that quote unquote IBM, but you also need to look at some of the up and comers. So I think if you are an earlier adopter, you can get in at a better price position. You can do things for your organization. You can use your logo for clout in terms of becoming more or less a premier customer. Whereas some of those like flagship products, the entrenched vendor, your logo may not provide as much value to them. I mean, obviously, depending on your your organization.
It surprises me a little bit, I guess, only for, do you have money that you're carrying around for the, just in case you find something cool on the shelf at Best Buy of identity?
Yeah, right.
I don't know many organizations that do. I mean, some do, right? And that's great. It's interesting that we're a little bit opposite in that regard. Like, I'm not afraid to go all in with it if I have the money to do it, but I generally don't have the money or the resources. I feel like I'm in the majority in this case.
Yeah, probably in the majority. But you also say somebody that's kind of like one of those flagship products now, SailPoint. They were the young up and comer at one point, right? Enough people had to kind of buy into that story, and kind of like that's what they leveraged growing up. Now, if you're one of those early ones in, those are probably still the customers that have influence, that know the executives at the top of the organization, that, I can't say that they're bossing them around or anything, but they're getting a lot more respect than they would get if they were just buying it now.
Yeah, I can see that. You get to wield a little bit more influence. I wonder if there's a little bit of a, back in my day, X product cost $20 and now it's like, $400 or like, where did all this price increase come from?
Yeah, exactly. So I think we should mention conferences. We got Identity Week America. I guess that's this summer, but you really need to be planning for these things in advance. So Identity Week Europe in Amsterdam, June 11th and 12th. Identity Week America, which you and I are going to play an active part personally in. That's going to be in DC, September 11th and 12th. And then Identity Week Asia in Singapore, October 22nd and 23rd. And our listeners get 30% off if they use the IDAC 30 discount code.
Yeah, it's a pretty sweet deal. That conference code or discount code, you got me saying it now, works for all of the conferences around the world. So whether you're going to Europe, America, Asia, IDAC 30% off. Very cool. I was at last year's. We talked about it in the last episode. Looking forward to again this year. I think, like you said, we'll be active participants. I think I'm going to host a panel again of some sort. Last year's was awesome. So we had like a real who's who of identity, and looking forward to doing something similar. And of course, we'll be doing podcasty things while we're there that are still to be determined.
I think that's one of my favorite parts about doing the podcast overall is just, being part of the conference circuit, bringing the conference to people who can't be there, interacting with people who are there, and bringing that to the podcast community. I just think the whole thing is like, it's really, I don't know. I feel like we're providing a service to the community, if you will.
The man on the street, the man in the field. You should get like one of those like reporter flak jackets that have like press on the front and like a helmet, and then like go into like Identiverse or Identity Week America or something like that with a microphone.
Yeah. Oh, you're not supposed to, if you're in a war zone like that, you're not supposed to shoot the person with that jacket on, so you're safe.
That's why you need the big press logo like on your chest and on your back so people know.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about the role of a systems operations center, or a SOC, as it's commonly referred to, when it comes to identity security. So I think this is an area that we really haven't touched on yet on the podcast. I think people have probably heard about it, but they're not really sure maybe what it is or what goes on in there. As Jim likes to say, what would you say you do here when it comes to a SOC perspective? So we're very fortunate that we actually have experts that we work with alongside every day as part of RSM's team. So I want to welcome from the RSM Managed Security Practice. First up, we've got Steve Kane, Managing Director. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
And we've also got Todd Willoughby. He's a director with the same practice. Welcome to the show, Todd.
Glad to be here, guys.
So before we get started, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions around this, and we kind of want to build expertise and knowledge in this. But before we do that, I always like to hear origin stories of how people got into InfoSec and identity and just things at large. Steve, we'll start with you. How did you get into the InfoSec space? I guess, when did you realize you were in the InfoSec space? Sometimes that's a question too.
It's actually a really good question, because sometimes you end up there and you don't even realize that you were headed down that path. For me, it really started about 25 years ago. I have always been an IT person at heart. Even when I was younger, I was always the go-to person in the family to go figure out things. Computers obviously being newer back in my day, it was always an interesting dilemma and conversation with friends and family. But I started in IT really at a healthcare facility. So we were in an elder care situation where I was working at the help desk and I was fielding all the calls initially. And that kind of grew into understanding more about applications, about how systems work. And from there, ended up moving in the direction of financial services. So I ended up at a large regional banking provider where I ultimately was responsible for managing all of the application technology components, software updates, and security updates. We had to deal with a lot of audits and everything else. So security really started to come into focus at that point, then moved back into the healthcare space, which is really where I have a personal passion for. So from there, I was responsible for not only the IT components of several hospitals, but also I was the HIPAA privacy and HIPAA security director for those facilities. So before I knew it, security was part of everything that I was doing, and then subsequently ended up for the last 15 years managing clients and SOC and growing business, et cetera. So here I am now, helping RSM kind of grow into that space as well. And really, it's ever changing, ever evolving, and constantly keeps you on your toes.
I bet. I think one of those things is, do you consider yourself an infosec person now at this point with your experience and kind of grown to that? Or do you still see as like a specialist in a certain area?
I have to consider myself an infosec person with this many years in one discipline like that. But you never really forget the roots. You still want to tinker around every now and then on some, home equipment or friends or family that might have stuff laying around, or if you happen to get extra time working on something, within your organization where there's test environments and stuff. So you still want to work things and actually hands on keyboard and be the intelligent hands like that, more so than just monitoring, doing incident response activities, et cetera. So definitely more of a infosec person than an IT person at this point, but you never forget your roots.
Todd, how about yourself? How did you get into this space?
That's a long story. I'll try to give you the abridged version. But much like Steve, I started working at a DSL help desk in college. It's pretty old technology, but still out there. It exists for a large DSL provider. And then from there, I went into, it's not, pay your bill or turn off your router, turn it back on again type of deal, literally that, to doing acceptable use policy violations and helping fulfill subpoenas and warrants for local law enforcement agencies for people doing nefarious things, with our services at the ISP at that time. And then from there, I went into a large early stage of my career doing government contracting, mainly around computer network and defense for various government agencies, the Army, the Navy, working intelligence as well there too. And then where I met Steve all these years ago. Steve and I have been together for a long time, almost a decade now. And we were at a large Big Four, and Steve and I ran that practice there. Essentially, we had 200 SOC analysts, threat hunters, SOC managers running that operation for large Fortune 50 clients. And then Steve and our friend Daniel convinced me to leave everything that we built over there and do it all over again here from scratch. So here we are.
Sounds like a very similar story. You guys have worked together for a long time. Jim and I have worked together for a long time. And now the four of us have worked for a much shorter time. I think probably a year and a half, roughly. For those who aren't familiar with what RSM brings to here, I don't want to turn this into a commercial for RSM, but give us the elevator pitch for what does the managed security practice do? What are some of the things that come out of it? I know we've had internal conversation around those things like RSM Defense and Unit 26, but tell us a little bit about what those are.
So for sure, we not only focus on the low level monitoring aspects. What we're trying to do for our clients is provide a end-to-end security stack of solutions that meet clients where they need to be met right now in their journey. So for us, it's as simple as having the conversations with our clients to really understand what their needs are, because as a consulting firm, we have the ability to expand and pull in the right resources at the right time. But from a managed security perspective, what we want to do is take the burden of day-to-day operations in various stages of our clients so that they can go focus on more high value, high demand type of activities. And we have everything from doing security monitoring all the way up through incident response activities, all the way through vCISO services, et cetera, that are all related to what we do from a managed security perspective. So we're really trying to help meet the clients where they are.
So the name RSM Defense, is that basically our term for the managed SOC?
Yes, that is the trademark name of our managed security, our managed SOC. Yes.
I can appreciate a trademark name, as we have trademarked our own as well. How about Unit 26? Where does Unit 26 fall into this?
I'll let Todd give that story, but it is tied to the RSM history a little bit, but I'll let Todd give that one.
Yeah, so you're not really a cool security team if you don't have a cool, witty name, right? That's pretty much industry standard. But no, it really came. The team wanted to. We have a big team aspect of what we do here, and making sure that we recognize that, and the team themselves picked that name. Right, 1926 is when RSM was initially founded. Unit 26, unit being a team, right? That's what we went with. That's where it came from. It's really the long and short of it.
So when we're talking about SOCs, we're not talking about Sarbanes-Oxley. We're not talking about those things you put on your feet. We're talking about SOC. So, Steve, what does SOC stand for, and what is it? Like, make it as simple as so everyone can understand.
For sure, Jim. So SOC stands for Security Operations Center. Its primary purpose is to provide infrastructure, people, process, technology surrounding monitoring your infrastructure in your client's environment, in your particular environment, in a secured fashion with, let's say, refined processes and procedures, and executing against those processes and procedures. So it's about having a self-contained unit of professionals that are there watching when nobody else is. And I think Todd uses this phrase quite often, but a lot of times the people that are in the SOC are the smart people in the basement type of thing, that when there's an incident that's coming or has occurred, these are the people that you want on your side, defending you and trying to understand where patient zero is and take all the necessary steps to respond and recover from a security incident, a cybersecurity incident.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you use that term patient zero. It sounds very much like a military term in a lot of ways, but I know it's not military, but more like, okay, where's this virus or sickness starting? But it's, I mean, the amount of attacks that are happening today, right? I mean, Todd, tell us, is it like a new ball game now than it was maybe a decade ago with instead of being attacked a couple of times a week, you're getting attacked 24 hours a day? What's the deal?
Yeah, Jim, that's a great question. Business is booming if you have somebody of questionable moral ethics, right? No, I mean, and frankly, it hasn't changed all that much, in my opinion, right? Some people will think so, and I'm sure there's some, larger edge cases that support that. The volume of them and the ease of them have certainly increased or be made easier over time, right? Since the, say, last 15 years, for example, right? There's more connected systems than ever. More things are, out there unsecured than ever. There's more applications. Your identities are controlling a lot more of this access to the data, right, that they were ever before in distributed systems that people particularly don't have visibility around. So yes, there's also a lot of things around, phishing. Like phishing is still one of the top three ways that cyber attacks occur, breaches occur, right? And we've had phishing point solutions out on the market now for the last 20 years, and nothing has seemingly got better. It's only gotten worse or made more easily and readily accessible to threat actors, right? So I think the answer is yes and no there, Jim. I think the other things that help establish those ease of attack vectors is, again, vulnerabilities. Now, back in the I say back in the day, I don't want to date myself, but usually when you would patch things, right, you had 30 days, right? Deploy to a non-prod system, test it, right? That's sadly not the case anymore. Patching around high CVE related vulnerabilities almost needs to be a tier 1 security incident, right? I mean, threat actors are developing capabilities faster than ever before to turn around vulnerabilities and exploits in maybe weeks, days, instead of months.
I always thought that a SOC would focus on activities like our network is being scanned, there's a DDoS attack. Is there more than that? I mean, you mentioned phishing. Is the SOC also important in those types of attacks?
Yeah, absolutely. Phishing is one of the biggest vectors of breaches and how they occur and incidents in general. Business email compromise is another big one on that list. I think it involves email just like phishing does. But ultimately what they're doing, the threat actors, is subverting the trust models of these companies and corporations. And they're going after the weakest links in those chains, right? Why would I, as a threat actor, try to breach your $1 million firewall solution, right? When I can just send an email and ask you for a password, right? It's a lot easier. Same thing goes with animals, right? I'm a hunter. I like going hunting, things like that. Animals don't walk straight uphill. They walk up on angles. They take the paths of least resistance. They may escalate to those more sophisticated types of attacks, but they're definitely going to try the low-hanging fruit first to get in, right? So it's become a game of kind of cat and mouse too, especially the way once they do get in, the way they move around inside, they're using legitimate applications and programs that you already use today to administer your systems. So it's being able to find out what the anomaly is. And, some of them are pretty tall tale signs. EDR certainly got a lot better and changed the game in that sense about making detections around endpoints, which are, the users use endpoints, right? So that's where we want to focus a lot of the attention, not all of it, but most of it. Yeah, it's gotten, I would say, easier in that.
And I've got to think that the identity-based attacks are, I mean, you've got to be focusing on that at some degree, right? Because really it's about getting in the front door, moving laterally, escalating privileges, seeing how far you can get, right? How is identity affecting or fitting into what the SOC does?
It's core. It's absolutely core. We have to have identity information to be able to do a good job at what we do every day. Identity is evolving, right? I mean, I think you guys talk about that every week on here. Not only do people have identities, but devices have identities, applications have identities, services now have identities. So the identity space, in that sense, the attack space is growing, right? So we have to know how those identities are being used to be able to detect anomalies, to be able to start incidents and detect breaches.
Steve, when would I know whether or not I could do a better job of doing my own security operations versus when I would outsource it? And is it black and white, or is there shades of gray?
As with everything, there are shades of gray in different areas. But in general terms, it's an expensive proposition to build a SOC for your own organization by yourselves. You're looking, to do it the right way, 24/7, have the right controls in place, have the right technologies in place to support that. You're generally looking north of $1 million to $2 million just to even kind of get started. Now, obviously, there are certain organizations that have compliance regulations or specific personnel requirements that mandate that they must go and make this investment. And then, they are obviously controlled and governed by frameworks such as NIST and FedRAMP and everything. So there are different needs for different companies in their different states. But 9 times out of 10, it is not a worthwhile cost efficiency to go and build your own SOC. You want to leverage the scalability and the cost favorability of a managed solution in that spot, Jim.
Yeah, I would imagine that it's, I think from a business standpoint, the way to look at insource versus outsource is I want to direct my own personnel to areas that provide business differentiation, business advantage or value versus my competitors. It seems like this kind of fits more into the infrastructure at some level and below, but that there is some business differentiation at some point where, it does make sense to have some of your own people. Is that what you're seeing a lot of organizations doing?
In a perfect world, you definitely have some of your own folks, especially on the, I'll say, a level 3 triage incident response side of the house, because you want your own people to know exactly where to go, what to do, and be able to react in a split second. And while a managed security team can do that well for most organizations, you're never going to be as intimately familiar with your own, with an external entity as you would be on your own internal side. So there's definitely where we find the best examples of successful security teams is where there's a blend of pulling in, managed security or external help in the appropriate areas while still maintaining your own, small core security team to help out. So definitely. And something back to add to Todd's notices. So from where we sit, the avenues of how threat actors get in are still the same ways, meaning it's still the low level tasks that need to be done, the patching, making sure that users are not clicking on things. It's the basic hygiene that will stop the majority of the threats. And Todd talked about all of that, but being a little bit older than the rest of you on the call, it still goes way back to early times in watching and managing security. It's check your front door, make sure there's as little gap as possible, and make sure that you've armed your own personal team, your staff, and all the business partners to understand where the risks come from and set that priority accordingly. But at the end of the day, it's always the basic hygiene stuff that gets a lot of our clients.
I'm the master of analogies here, and one of the things I like to equate it back to is, look, if you were gonna commit a criminal act, right, especially like a breaking and entering or something like that, would you rather break into a house that has a bunch of security lighting and fences around it, or would you be more advantageous to break into a house that's got a bunch of overgrown bushes, no lighting, perimeter lighting, things like that? Well, that's obviously going to be the target of opportunity there at that point. And I've written several times about this on our RSM blog, but you have to make yourself just sometimes unattractive enough to waste time so that they move on to easier targets sometimes. Right? And doing those small things is a big piece of that.
Yeah, we've talked about this where you don't have to be faster than everyone else, just faster than your friends when the bear is chasing you.
That's right.
Exactly. Yeah. That is true for a lot of us. I mean, to be honest, like it does seem kind of cliche and funny, right? But that is, if you have a semblance of roadblocks or making it difficult for threat actors to achieve their goals on objectives, I mean, time is money to them, just like it is time is money to us in the business world sometimes, right? So you move on to deals that are more lucrative and going to return your investment sooner, right?
I think it's probably worth calling out that there's different types of attacks, right? If you are, a random recipient of something like that, that might be. But if you're a target, somebody is literally targeting your organization. Now we're talking about a different level of threat, right? It really doesn't matter how much faster you are because they are looking to specifically get into your place. How does that play into the work that the SOC does? Do they become aware that, there is a target, that there's a specific target on someone's back when it comes to this? Or does that get discovered as you go through this process? Walk me through what that looks like.
Absolutely. So one of the components of our service, we have a very good threat intelligence apparatus in our team. We have people that spent years doing threat intelligence for the government, things like that, right? Yeah, we do run across through some of our open and closed sources of investigation that are pending attacks. Clients are trying to purchase and broker access into these certain client environments and things like that. And we do get heads up on those. Hey, you're correct, Jeff. And the one thing I'll say is, once you do have a target on your back and you're not a victim of, I would say, some commodity drive-by malware, right, or ransomware, you have a serious problem on your hands, because if, depending on the data that you have and what you have and what they want, right, is good enough or great enough, like, they will continue to come back, right? And they will not continue to come back and just attacking you directly. They'll come at your compliances, the regulatory bodies. They will come at you through third parties and vendors, right? To try to gain access. And the attack surface just continues to expand. If you have somebody that is confirmed action targeting you, or the data that you have at that point, you have a serious problem.
Steve, you mentioned your long history in this, and that's something I wanted to ask you before is, have you seen the evolution of how a SOC operates change over the years, or is it still fundamentally the same?
The demands and the stress on a SOC nowadays is, I'll say, tenfold, just because of the expansion of where the threat sources can come from, where the threat actors are targeting. And as we have progressed, moving from on-prem equipment to the cloud, back to on-prem, back to cloud, and cloud really taking a hold right now with everything we do, with SaaS-based platforms, et cetera. The number of investigations and the number of sources of potential threats is exponentially larger than it was even 10 years ago. So that evolution will continue until until the threat actors are gone, which is never going to happen at this point. Because again, they're a business just like anything else. And as long as they have some motivating factors, whether it be political, financial, or whatever, it's still gonna happen. At the end of the day, we're human for right now until AI takes over at some point. But we're human right now, and things are going to be accessible, and all the good intention that we can possibly do is not going to prevent every single attack.
One thing to expand on there real quick is, I think Steve hit a big point there, right? Is we on the defensive side of the house, and this was even true, back in the day when we're working at the government, stuff like that, was we have to get it right all the time, right? And we have levels of, say, bureaucracy that we have to go through to plug in a proverbial Ethernet cable, right? These people don't have that level of bureaucracy. They're very agile. They're very again, motivated. They don't have to ask for permission, and they just have to get it right once, right? So the stakes are high. And also what Steve mentioned too is, hitting on proliferation of data, right? There is so much data out there, right? And that's one thing I try to stress to clients is, they want to collect this data source, they collect that data source. And sometimes you have to ask, well, why? Because now we have to secure it. There's some good use cases for that, right? And there's some good use cases for not collecting it, because you don't have to secure it.
Steve, I want to make this actionable for our listeners, something that they can take away, and maybe something that if they are responsible for security operations, that they can do something to improve their world. And I started off the question of, when should I build my own SOC, and when should I go the managed service route? It sounds like there's this, it's really a shade of gray in a lot of cases. But I also want to know, what are the economics, and putting it to the point, okay, maybe I have a SOC already. It's something I run in-house. Maybe it's partially I'm using some managed services. How do I look at that? But also, if I'm greenfield, I don't have this today, how do I approach this from, whether or not to start from scratch and build some of my own versus going the managed route?
So a lot of things to consider, Jim, in that question. And for the listeners on this podcast, it's imperative that you understand there's no right or wrong way to do this. At the end of the day, as long as you are meeting the security objectives of your organization, you can do this in whichever way makes the most sense to achieve those objectives. But the first thing you need to do is understand what is governing the outcomes from your security perspective? Meaning, are you compliance driven? Are you driven by merger and acquisition targets? Are you driven by your own data? Are you driven by your intellectual property? Like, there are various ways that you could be governed by. And once you understand what that is, then come back and say, okay, I have a team of 3 people currently. They're doing, some IT, some security, and some running around field service type activity. You don't have a full-fledged SOC because, again, 3 people are not going to cover 24 hours a day. And the misnomer that threats only happen 8 to 5, long time out the window. Organizations that think they're protected just because they are doing it while they're working, most of the time your threat actors are 10 time zones over, and they are just getting started. So it's imperative that you also realize that if your environment, if your business is doing any kind of digital transaction of any kind, then you're susceptible no matter how small or how large you are. And a lot of times the smaller organizations don't realize how susceptible they are because they could affect companies upstream based on how many, what third parties are involved in the process. So once you identify what your objectives are, what your current basis is, at the end of the day, it comes down to people and or technology to support the effort. While you can do this with, traditional SIMs or cloud-based services or XDR or, pick your acronym of choice, you still need to make investment in people to understand what that is right now. There are things that AI is going to help with, certainly down the line as that gets smarter and adapts to threat actor models, et cetera. But for right now, it still needs to have some level of human involvement to make the right executions for the business at hand. A lot of times, like I said, you're going to need north of $1 million probably just to get started, between having enough staff, having the tools to do it, and writing and training all of the people, writing the policies for all the folks, constantly updating and training to stay abreast of current threats. So there's a lot of things to really consider that I want the audience to understand, that this is not you turn it on tomorrow and then you're ready to go. We want to make sure that folks are successful wherever they are in whatever fashion they want to do.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and you covered a lot of ground there. Todd, I was kind of like keying off of some of the technologies that Steve mentioned there early on. I guess one of my fundamental questions is, when you look at a SOC, what are you doing? Are you like doing that SIM function, like pulling in the logs from systems? Is it that plus SOM? Walk us through that. What, more or less, it's kind of like how do I get started? But it's more just explain to folks, like, how's the SOC thing done?
Yeah, Jim, that's a good question. There could be a long answer, that could be a short answer. And the short answer I'll give you is, as a general practitioner in the SOC, I would want as much data backing up my analysis and investigations as possible. So data from whatever disparate sources or systems or stack tools that you may have, including identity, even tools that people wouldn't think would be relevant to security operations. I can assure you, if it's 2:00 in the morning and something's going on, they are 100% relevant. If it requires me as the operator there to make a determination to bring down a domain controller because something's weird going on, or disable a VIP user in the middle of the night, right? The more context is better, right? And that's one of the things that identity is helping doing, is bring context to a lot of the security alerts, right? Especially around what their roles are, their permissions they may be in the organization. Identity is key to bringing a lot of that context in that we need to make those decisions. Ultimately, sometimes within 15 minutes and less, depending on what SLAs are, right? Things like that. But Again, at the other side of that, Jim, is, what we're doing is monitoring, detecting, responding, and trying to prevent threats, right? And monitoring requires bringing in all that data, right? We don't have the data, and especially if you don't have it brought into a normalized taxonomy, you're also going to have a problem there from a SOC perspective. So a lot of the SIM systems do a lot of good job at that today. And then the detection piece is also hard to do, right? Just because you go out and spend a bunch of money on a SIM system, it's just a framework, right? Same thing with a bunch of EDR tools. You can go get the new shiny EDR that's off the shelf at Black Hat, right? And it's still not going to really do all that good for you, right? I mean, they have gotten better, but if you don't have a threat detection engineering team or something like that, writing rules for what is bad or what is known bad in environments, it's going to make that tool less and less effective, right? And less ROI, and you end up going to ripping it out and replace it for another, blinky, shiny box, right? So yeah, there's a lot of work, as Steve said, going into that, right? But yeah, I mean, the data is the most important thing, right? And having the data normalized when we're searching username or source IP, it's searching across all of those systems and these taxonomies so that we know what we're applying to and we see all the whole context right in front.
Yeah, to add to what Todd's saying, because he's 100% correct, but being that this is an identity podcast, we want to make sure that we keep bringing back the role of not only the user, but the asset that ties everything together as well. The understanding what is normal behavior from abnormal behavior is such an important piece of what the SOC is monitoring. Knowing that ordinarily a person accesses these 5 applications every single day. Well, all of a sudden on day 6, they access something that they have never done before, and it's not in their business context to do so. That should send up a red flag immediately. And it does if you're configured properly in the underlying systems. It will raise a flag as far as changing the risk score of that particular user. A lot of alerts come from identities logging in from remote locations that they're not usually coming in from. And a lot of it is noise because of VPNs and people are traveling. We're a global society at this point. So a lot of it is noise. However, unless somebody is visiting Nigeria or Japan or China or whatever, why would somebody be logging in from those places? And your VPNs are not going to be sourced in those countries. So that's the time that you want to at least investigate. Well, wait a minute. Joe Smith has never left the country. Why all of a sudden he's logging into here? So it is super imperative and has been an increasingly necessary data source for any SOC at this point, given the proliferation of how identities are used.
And just to lay onto that, even a more tactical perspective, right? A lot of these, it's good to know that Joe is logging in from Laos, right? Or Vietnam or something like that. But what user agent he's using to do so comparatively to the old ones he's seen on the environment, what Windows device or what operating system they're using. Things like that are very important context that these identity systems are bringing in from the SOC.
So help me understand this from a step-by-step process. Can you kind of take me through what the anatomy of a breach would look like? What's the SOC doing to prevent this or to mitigate the chances of this happening? Todd, I think we were kind of talking about maybe putting some examples together. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so great question. I mean, there is going to be a couple of phases that are always absolute in every, breach or incident, right? Or cyber attack, however you want to lay it out. There's going to be some level of reconnaissance that the adversary is going to do against you, right? They're going to use that to determine weaknesses, vectors of infection, right? Attack surfaces that they can go after, right? It's like any good research, right? I mean, and Jim brought this up earlier. A lot of it sounds military because it's kind of like that, right? The methodologies behind it, they certainly relate in a lot of ways. That's why you see a lot of, particularly ex-military, ex-government people in, cybersecurity, things like that as well. But I digress. But so there's going to be some sort of reconnaissance phase that they're going to go after to try to probe you, essentially, or figure out what you're about, right? That could be social engineering attacks, phishing emails, right? Things like that. And then there's going to come a phase of initial compromises when they're going to make their vector of infection, right? They're either going to exploit some sort of software, that phishing email they sent is going to be successful, right? They're going to take advantage of a vulnerability or something like that. The third phase of that is really going to be, maintaining persistence. Once they got a foothold in the machine, the next thing I'm going to do as a threat actor is make sure I don't lose access, right? And that's where we're also seeing a lot of the monetization of attacks nowadays. That's where some people stop, right? There's things out there in the industry, initial access brokers, and that's all they're doing. Going in, getting access, and selling that access. They're not actually, crypting anything, stealing anything per se, right? But they're compromising the systems to then send it to somebody or sell it to somebody who is going to take that next step, right? So once they have a foothold in your system, and at this time, they're usually either creating new accounts, creating new identities, just maintaining access, right? Creating backdoors, web shells, whatever it may be that they're going to use to maintain access. They're going to try to move around laterally in the network, right? That expands their access to the network. They'll start trying to figure out where they are, what other systems they can hit. Because you get into a network, you don't really know where you're at sometimes, right? Or if you're on an end user machine, you want to get more access to see if you can get admin rights, things like that, right? There's usually that's going to get followed by some sort of initial attack payload or installation of attack, right? Installing exfiltration tools or remote desktop softwares that we're seeing now. Like this is recording now, AnyDesk, the incident just happened the other day. Things like that, right? Or they could be using your infrastructure to support their operations for crypto mining and things like that. Usually some sort of malware is involved in that stage. The last two stages are probably the most important ones, right? Is the actions and the objectives, right? So the actions that they're going to take is ultimately stealing the data, disrupting your operations, which is also what they're there for, right? There's a lot of activist organizations out there that just want to bring down services and nothing else, right? But this is their actions and objectives, so their goals. You're going to start seeing the data getting exfilled, right? Deploying ransomware, things are going to start getting encrypted, right? Denial of service attacks are going to start happening. And then finally, the last bit of it is the escape plan, right? Is getting out, right? Destroying evidence, avoiding detections, right? And usually that's where a lot of breaches and incidents are detected. And that's where we don't, as a defensive operator, right? That's not where we want to catch things when things are going off at the end of the day. And essentially at that point, you've lost, right? This is where they're erasing your evidence, covering your tracks, clearing audit logs, disabling other security tools, right? Things of that nature. That's the general 30,000 foot overview of the anatomy of attack. And you can see there in just some of those things I mentioned where identity would play a large role in helping provide context and stopping attacks as well.
Yeah, I was thinking as you're going through that there are certain steps along the way that probably have a certain signature or footprint to them where it's like, okay, I'm on a laptop, I've got administrative access. Now I connect to a download site on the dark web, quote unquote, or in Russia or wherever. And you're like, now you go out and connect to that site. That's a pretty hot indicator, right?
Well, Jim, I think that's the thing is it's even easier than that, right? That's what you think is happening. That is not what's happening. What is happening is they're using the same shared services infrastructure that everybody's using. If I'm a threat actor and I'm exfilling data to some Tor node in Russia, that's some rookie level stuff, in my opinion. That's to be serious, right? I'm going to spin up a new Amazon EC2 instance, attack you from infrastructure that's not listed on any list, that's not showing out in any country, using Azure services, right? Things like that to pull data to known good IPs. And this is how they're good at blending in, or provide, a backend to a bulletproof hosting infrastructure where they can't get taken down. They're hosted out of contentious regions like Ukraine, southern Ukraine, right? No one's going to go serve a subpoena to take down a server in Donstock right now, right? It's just not happening. But yeah, I mean, it's even simpler than that, right? I mean, we've even seen attacks where we had a regionalized hospital that was based in the northwest of the United States. All the attacks came from Seattle, where they're located. So the adversary, again, during that reconnaissance phase, knows where their infrastructure is hosted, so that would blend in better to say sending something to Nigeria. I mean, if that's going to Nigeria or Russia, we're going to pick up on that immediately and shut that down, making it harder by blending in with what is known good, right? They're using Amazon, they're using GCP, they're using Oracle Cloud, right? Using those infrastructures against, right?
Yeah, that's cool stuff. I mean, cool from the standpoint, like I didn't think of
I agree.
that angle,
Yes.
but
It is cool.
it's all about not being detected, right?
Yeah, and that's some of the things. I mean, that's where a SOC operator's job and an analyst job is harder, right? It is. I tell people I've done a lot of SOC analyst interviews in my time, and I tell people like it is the most rewarding and thankless job at the same time, right? Because your job is difficult, right? If one little thing gets through, like, it's coming down on you, right? To some degree. Hopefully, you have leadership that'll help stable that for you, but. Essentially, right, you have to get it right all the time, right? And that's where they just have to get it right once.
Equated to a football game. You're on defense. You have no idea what play is being called on the offense side. And you have to prevent them from getting to the end zone or scoring. That's in essence the job on the SOC side, is to make sure that you've laid out all of your defenses possible to try and prevent them from staging forward. And it is never going to be 100% effective, but your job is to keep as many of the bogeys out of the end zone as possible. And Todd's right. It is a super rewarding job. It is super hard. But a lot of organizations they don't always provide the backing and support for folks in that role. So it is a high burnout, type of role.
It's an easy apparatus. Yeah, it's an easy apparatus to blame when
Yes.
something goes wrong, right? And when there's systemic problems above that, right, from a program standpoint, a maturity standpoint, things like that, right?
Yeah, I hope you're picking up like our passion for what we do, because it doesn't matter the organization. This is a necessary item to protect yourself, your clients, your customers, etc. And unless you have some level of passion for it, it's not going to be done right. So that's when you really need to look and say, is this what we really should be spending our efforts on, or do we rely on some experts to kind of help us with that? So you'll get the sense of, Todd and I probably should do our own podcast at some point. But you'll get the sense that we have passion for this topic because it is super important for us and what we do.
I got an idea. SOC at the center.
There you
something
go.
like that.
Something like that.
I got two final questions, and we'll end on a lighter note. You kind of touched on my first one, which is what happens when things break down? Nothing is perfect. What happens when something gets missed? I mean, it's got to happen in the real world, right? Steve, what happens when, the service fails?
So dependent upon the threat actor and the type of vector that they're getting in, it could be, let me take a step back. This is why you don't have one layer of defense. You have multiple layers of defense. So if they get through the first layer, then your secondary controls should take into effect. So say an end user clicks on a phishing link. So they first layer destroyed, they got through. But your second layer, your DNS, your endpoint, your email threat protection, that should be your second layer of defense, protecting you from any further harm. Well, now if you have a third, like they get through that somehow because your controls were not as effective. Now you have a third layer of defense where you've isolated networks to control that. Okay, so if somebody actually did get in, it's only going to affect these 20 assets right here. So it's important to implore or perform a defense in depth kind of strategy as it relates to protecting environments, because no single line of defense is ever perfect. And you want to make sure that you are at least isolating your critical assets away from anything that could be impacted. So that critical crown jewel is defined by the organization as, IP, formulas, secrets, trade secrets, etc. Like you need to keep them as quote unquote air gapped as possible, such that they do not get exposed, because ultimately that could be not only brand reputation, but long-term effect of impact to the group.
Yeah, making catastrophic to the business.
Yes.
So trying to avoid that. All right. So you guys have sufficiently scared me, but what if I'm not scared and I want to become a SOC analyst? What would you recommend for somebody who's listening out there? It's like, oh, that sounds interesting. How do I get into that world as a newbie or a beginner in the space? Todd, I don't know. Maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah. You gotta be curious. I think that's the thing, right? A lot of, and this could be a whole other episode on, how kids that are graduating out of the education programs around cybersecurity. There's a worldwide industry talent shortage, and I can understand some of that. But a lot of them aren't coming prepared out of school to be SOC analysts. But you have to be curious, right? If you think you're going to sit back and wait for these tools to make detections for you, and you're not going to understand the fundamentals of how those detections were formulated and made and things like that, like you're going to have a hard time. I think at least here at RSM, you're going to have a hard time. But yeah, you gotta understand. You also have to check your ego at the door, right? There's things that you and Jeff, Jim know that I don't know. There's things that I know that you don't know. We have that kind of mantra in the Security Operations Center here at RSM is, everybody knows something, everybody brings something different. It's a real team aspect around that. And we have to parlay off each other, and you have to be okay with getting it wrong sometimes, as long as you're doing and what your actions are doing at the time and your analysis are justifiable and defensible, trying to protect and do what's right for the clients. I don't think you ever have a problem out of me, right? But it's when you're not doing anything, right? That's the problems. But yeah, I mean, you gotta, again, this is another thing is like, I don't know what I would do if I had to do this job over again. And like, I don't want to seem like this is belittling or anything, but like, if I had to put steering wheels on at like a car manufacturing plant, like I think I'd go insane, like every day doing the same job over and over. This job is very repetitive, but what changes every day is the tactics and techniques in there. So you're constantly having to learn new ways to make detections, see the activity, see the traffic that you're going on. So it's very exciting from that point, that they're always trying to game one up on you, right? The threat actors, right? So it's a constant learning battle. Your learning never stops. And, frankly, a lot of the, if you're going to get into the SOC business, understand like it is a tough game as well, too. There's rotating schedules. Like we don't shut down, right? We're like 7-Eleven. We're always open, right? That's hard on people too, especially working overnight shifts. When I first started doing this, I worked in a SOC full time and went to college full time. So I would work 5 p.m. to 2 a.m. every night and have class the next day. It's very rough, but you got to want to do it. It's got to be a passion of yours. And we definitely see a difference in the people that have a passion for it versus people that want to do it to collect a paycheck as well. So you have to be willing to be wrong. You got to continuously learn, and you got to put yourself out there.
Steve, do you have anything to add?
No, he stole my thunder. For me, when I'm doing interviews, and obviously Todd and I are yin and yang on interviews. So what I'm looking for is I can teach most people anything. So from a technical perspective, I'm less worried about, did you go to this SANS course, or did you learn this particular thing, or did you get this, Sec Plus certification, et cetera. Like we can teach people that. If you aren't a fast learner and curious about why a certain thing happens, your success as a SOC analyst will be difficult, because it's that curiosity that drives your thought patterns on where to look for things. And once we would teach you the paths to look for, then it's up to you to put all of that together and say, okay, now A does equal B equals C, and then it goes to a letter that I don't know yet, but I know that it's not something that is correct or a positive outcome. So it really comes down to how curious you are about learning and what the next thing is. So just like a 4-year-old or whatever asking the constant why, that's the kind of mentality that actually will do well as not only a SOC analyst, but as an incident responder and as other areas in the detect and respond side of the house.
You got to have an investigation mindset, investigation-based mindset, right? I equivalent a lot of it to it. I tell this to the SOC team, especially the new people that have never worked in a SOC, is You're a police officer. You showed up to a crime scene. It's just you and whatever's in front of you at the crime scene, right? What do? Well, you got to start asking neighbor, right? Got to start canvassing the area, looking for cameras, looking for evidence, right? There's a bunch of things in that investigatory mindset that you have to have. It's the same thing translates into a SOC, right? An alert goes off. That's just the genesis of where you need to begin. Like, where do I need to go find firearm logs? Who is this user? What are they doing on the network? What access roles do they have, right? You got to go through all that very quickly too.
All right. So we're up over an hour. We're going to start to wrap it up. We got a little serious there at the end. So we have to end on a lighter note. Steve, you brought up Super Bowl or football analogies. We're going to talk about the Super Bowl. Here's my question for all of you. So by the time people listen to this, it's going to be Monday, February 12th. The Super Bowl would have taken place last night. We're recording this a week in advance. Who is going to win the Super Bowl? And why is it going to be the 49ers? Todd, we'll start with you.
Well, being a Philadelphia sports fan, I hope none of them win. I'll say that. But I think the Chiefs are going to win. I think their offense is too potent. Their defense has been stepping up recently in the last couple of weeks here, especially in the playoffs. I think equally could be said about the 49ers, but I just don't think they have the talent there on the offensive side to get it done.
Boo, wrong answer. Jim, how about yourself? Who are you picking between the 49ers and the Chiefs?
I was hoping not to even have this conversation with you, Jeff, because obviously you're biased. Okay. But
I don't know what you're talking about. We're vendor neutral here.
Vendor neutral, except when it comes to NFL. I'm going with the Chiefs. And the reason why is Patrick Mahomes. I mean, look at all those Super Bowls that the Patriots won. And I think it came down to Tom the GOAT. And I just think that Mahomes is going to find a way to win. Sorry to tell you that, Jeff. I don't think it's going to be a blowout, but I do think he's got the edge.
All right. 0 for 2. Steve.
All right. So
why are the 49ers going to win?
So everyone's ignoring the elephant in the room. The reason the Chiefs are going to win is because of Taylor. That is the reason that they're going to win. At least that's the way the media will have you believe.
Finally, a real NFL analysis getting done here.
I think she just won a Grammy last night. Obviously, I'm unfortunately not in the United States, so I can't see the Grammys from where I am in El Salvador currently.
She did win.
Besides the fact, as a loyal Philadelphia fan, and unfortunately, Jeff, you've got 3 of us on the call here on the podcast today. I don't know how you did that. And witnessing what happened last year when the Eagles should have won that flipping football game in the Super Bowl. There's no way Kansas City loses the game. Again, it will not be a blowout, but they got hot at the right time of the year. They were really mediocre or horrible in the beginning part of the year, but they turned it on at the right time. And I think it's just a matter of time to complete that. So unfortunately, it will not be the 49ers. It will be Kansas City Chiefs.
It's a real shame to have so many smart people on this podcast and not be able to pick the right team.
Ruin it in the last 30 seconds.
That's right. I'm going to cut this out. Since I do all the editing, I'm going to make you guys say, oh, yeah, the 49ers are going to win. Obviously, I'm going for the 49ers. Been a fan forever and will continue to be so. I think they win 35-28. I think it'll be a close game. I don't want it to be a blowout. I want it to be a good game.
Lock. That's a lock.
I think they'll lock it in, get those bets in, and don't hold me accountable. This has been a great conversation. We're going to leave it there. I know that there's kind of a lot to cover. This is kind of the beginnings of it, but I'm glad you guys were able to make some time for us to talk through this. I think this is an area that, again, a lot of people hear about, but they don't really kind of get to peel back and look behind the curtain sometimes. So I appreciate you guys taking the time with us. We'll have some links in our show notes for people to check out. Todd, you mentioned some blog stuff that you've written, so we'll get a link to that in our show notes if you want to check that out. And then if you guys want to connect, we always put LinkedIn profiles, so you can connect with Todd and Steve as well as Jim and myself as we go through that. And then we're on the web, idacpodcast.com, Twitter at idacpodcast, Mastodon at idacpodcast at infosec.exchange. Still don't like the way Mastodon does their names, but nothing can be done about it right now. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Keep sharing with it. I continue to see a Reddit thread that keeps talking about how people enjoy the show. So hats off to the folks who are in that thread. Not that I was checking it or anything while we were recording, but it was kind of cool to see that. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.